So much of what he addresses in this book and these sermons are every bit as applicable today as they were 50 years ago. Hey Christians, it's Daniel. Let's talk about a book today. The book is called Strength to Love by Martin Luther King Jr. I recently finished reading this book, and I want to be completely honest with you. It is the first book of Martin Luther King Jr.'s that I've ever read. It's his first work that I've ever really read. Sure, I've heard the speeches, I've seen the quotes, I've heard, about his life a little bit, but I've never read any of his stuff. And I was tired of being kind of that white Christian minister who Martin Luther King Day rolls around and I post a fun little inspirational picture with a quote of his that makes us all feel good and realize how good of a man he was. And everybody honors him and everybody recognizes him. And I was tired of being that guy, of sharing quotes from MLK without actually having read his stuff. Because the more I find out about him, most white Christians did not like him. In fact, he was the subject of an FBI investigation. He was on one of their most wanted lists for causing all the trouble in the nation, for leading these protests and for leading the civil rights movement. People hated him. White Christians hated him. He was assassinated in 1968. That wasn't that long ago. That was only 52 years. Many of the older Christians in our churches probably remember that day. He was 39 years old. I'm 32. He wasn't that old. He was doing these great things and leading all these movements in his late 20s and early 30s, and he didn't want to. It's not like he set out to change the world. He didn't want to be thrust into the middle of the Montgomery bus boycott. He didn't want to be thrust into the middle of the civil rights movement. He didn't want to go to prison. He didn't want to lead these marches, but people heard what he was saying, and he had a drive and a calling and a passion toward racial justice and equality that drove him into these situations, whether he wanted to or not. So he had a calling on his life, and he followed that calling, and people hated him for it. And I wanted to know why. I wanted to figure out why. What was he saying that was so dangerous? What was he saying that was so divisive? Even a lot of times, even among the black communities. What was it that he was preaching that was so radical? And so I bought this book earlier in the month and read through it. It's a pretty easy read, so I highly recommend it, by the way. It's a pretty easy read. This book, Strength to Love, is a recording of his sermons. So he's given a lot of these sermons in church settings. In fact, several of these sermons were written from a Georgia prison. A lot of these were written in the midst of the bus boycott and the fight for desegregation. And as I'm reading through these, each chapter is pretty short. It's only like, 5 to 6 pages maybe per chapter. Like I said, they're sermons. So as I'm reading these sermons of his, I'm thinking, this could have been preached last Sunday. So much of what he addresses in this book and these sermons are every bit as applicable today as they were 50 years ago. He addresses everything from segregation and racial justice to economic issues to the problem of evil within man. He speaks out against the evils of communism. He speaks out against the evils of these systems that hold down the oppressed with an iron fist, or in our case, with a knee to the neck. Yeah, he's speaking about issues from the 1960s, but he could have just as easily been referring to the cases like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. You better believe that if he were still alive today, he would be out there marching in the streets too. Let me just draw some attention to some of these quotes. So in his chapter, on this very first chapter, he starts out by talking about a tough mind and a tender heart, quoting from He starts with the quote from Jesus when he tells his disciples, "Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." So he talks about having a tough mind but a tender heart. And listen to what he says. Soft-mindedness is one of the basic causes of race prejudice. Race prejudice is based on groundless fears, suspicions, and misunderstandings. There are those who are sufficiently soft-minded to believe in the superiority of the white race and the inferiority of the Negro race, in spite of the tough-minded research of anthropologists. Too many politicians in the South recognize this disease of soft-mindedness that engulfs their constituency. With insidious zeal, they make inflammatory statements and disseminate distortions and half-truths that arouse abnormal fears and morbid antipathies within the minds of uneducated and underprivileged whites, leaving them so confused that they are led to acts of meanness and violence that no normal person commits. He concludes with, "A nation or a civilization that continues to produce soft-minded men purchases its own spiritual death on an installment plan." Ouch. One that really got me was in the same chapter. He says, "We must learn that passively to accept an unjust system is to cooperate with that system and thereby to become a participant in its evil." Wow. So you have so many people talking about systemic racism. You have so many people talking about white supremacy. He's talking about those things 50 or 60 years ago. He could have preached this sermon yesterday. Talking about conformity. He says this, and I'm not going to read you all the quotes that I highlighted in this book. That would take way too long. But these I just thought stood out. And this really spoke to me on a personal level. He says, "Many people fear nothing more terribly than to take a position that stands out sharply and clearly from the prevailing opinion. The tendency of most is to adopt a view that is so ambiguous that it will include everything and so popular that it will include everybody. Along with this has grown an inordinate worship of bigness. We live in an age of, quote, jumboism, where men find security in that which is large and extensive. Big cities, big buildings, big corporations. This worship of size has caused many to fear being identified with a minority idea. Not a few men who cherish lofty and noble ideas hide them under a bushel for fear of being called different. Many sincere white people in the South privately oppose segregation and discrimination, but they are apprehensive lest they be publicly condemned. Millions of citizens are deeply disturbed that the military-industrial complex too often shapes national policy, but they do not want to be considered unpatriotic. This stuff is still happening today." I think this just goes to show the prophetic voice of Martin Luther King Jr. And as all prophets before, Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people persecute you and condemn your name as evil because of me, for that's how they treated the prophets who were before you." That's how they treated Martin Luther King Jr. That's how we treat people today in our society. People start speaking out against things and we label them. Maybe if we actually sat down and had conversations, then we might actually get somewhere. He goes on through this book. Like I said, every chapter is basically a punch to the gut. I want to read just one more thing. Well, two more things. So recall back to the last video about the gospel and social justice. I made that video and then I read this chapter. Oh my goodness. He says, "We must pray for peace, but we must also work vigorously for disarmament and the suspension of weapon testing. We must use our minds as rigorously to plan for peace as we have used them to plan for war. We must pray with unceasing passion for racial justice, but we must also use our minds to develop a program, organize ourselves in a mass nonviolent action, and employ every resource of our bodies and souls to bring an end to racial injustice. We must pray unrelentingly for economic justice, but we must also work diligently to bring into being those social changes that make for a better distribution of wealth within our nation and in the underdeveloped countries of the world. Does not all of this reveal the fallacy of thinking that God will cast evil from the earth even if man does nothing except to sit complacently by the wayside? No prodigious thunderbolt from heaven will blast away evil. No mighty army of angels will descend to force men to do what their wills resist. The Bible portrays God not as an omnipotent czar who makes all decisions for his subjects, nor as a cosmic tyrant who, with Gestapo-like methods, invades the inner lives of men, but rather as a loving father who gives to his children such abundant blessings as they may be willing to receive. Always man must do something. Stand upon thy feet, says God to Ezekiel, and I will speak unto you. Man is no helpless invalid left in a valley of total depravity until God pulls him out. Man is rather an upstanding human being whose vision has been impaired by the cataracts of sin and whose soul has been weakened by the virus of pride. But there is sufficient vision left for him to lift his eyes into the hills, and there remains enough of God's image for him to turn the weak and sin-battered life toward the great physician, the curer of the ravages of sin. So pray, but do something. Wow. He could be speaking directly to our society today. He ends with this. And when I read this, the very last paragraph of this book, knowing that just 5 years later, he would be assassinated and that we're still going through the same struggles even 50 years later, it just gave me chills, made me want to cry. He says, "The past decade has been a most exciting one. In spite of the tensions and uncertainties of this period, something profoundly meaningful is taking place. Old systems of exploitation and oppression are passing away. New systems of justice and equality are being born. In a real sense, this is a great time to be alive. Therefore, I am not yet discouraged about the future. Granted that the easygoing optimism of yesterday is impossible. Granted that we face a world crisis that leaves us standing so often amid the surging murmurs of life's restless seas. But every crisis has both its dangers and its opportunities. It can spell either salvation or doom. In a dark, confused world, the kingdom of God may yet reign in the hearts of men." So that's the book, Strength to Love. I highly recommend you check it out. Buy a copy on Amazon or wherever you get your books and really take his message to heart. He was prophetic for his time, and his prophetic voice still speaks to us today. Hey, Christians, let's talk again soon.